If you're ready for honest conversations on a variety of health topics and a return to the fundamentals of natural and holistic healing, welcome. Grab your filtered water, get comfortable, and let's drop some truth.
Hi, guys. Welcome back to Truth Bombs and Tinctures. I'm Dr. Robin Tauzin. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Aviva Wertkin.
Hi, everybody.
And today we are getting into part 2 of Bought and Paid For, the Corruption of Science. So hopefully you got to join us for part 1, where we dove into a bunch of examples showing how corrupt science is with FDA approval and who's funding the studies and the methods that they're using. And hopefully we didn't bore you to tears. And hopefully there was some mind-blowing facts that you learned. Today we're going to get into a few more interesting little truth bombs that we're going to dive into.
The topics we're going to go over today are even more controversial. And when we dive into them, many people may have a strong emotional response because these are things that people really do not want to know about. Generally speaking, when anybody starts to share the truth and the science on these topics, what happens is that person ends up being on the receiving end of a lot of attacks, a lot of slander. This is what happens. And I want you guys to recognize this. People don't go after the facts. They go after the people. And these things that are happening, we feel are so important for the public to know that we are both willing to take on this risk and being on the receiving end of a lot of hatred from people because we're saying things that people don't really want to know and hear about. Some of you already have a sense of this. Some of you already know, but for some people, I just want to let you know some of the information we're revealing can be really, really upsetting if you're not familiar.
I do want to remind you guys, keep an open mind. What we're showing you here is just facts. Listen to it and go check it out for yourself so you can see what's true.
So before we dive into the next series of examples, I want to circle back to the gold standard in research and the gold standard of study designs, which don't really apply to all research studies, but in the context of your average drug trial, they're going to be designed as what's called a double-blind placebo-controlled study. And if you're not familiar with research, those words may not have any meaning to you. Let me just briefly explain what a double-blind placebo-controlled study means. So double-blind means that both the investigator, the person who's administering the medication, is blinded to, meaning unaware of whether they're giving the person the active medication or a placebo. At the same time, the person who's participating in the study, who's receiving the medication or the placebo, they're also blinded to it, meaning they don't know what they're getting. So double blind means the person giving it and the person taking it has no idea if they're getting an active substance or an inert substance. So the placebo part of the trial means you need to compare the drug to an inert substance to adequately evaluate if the drug fits the profile for safety and efficacy. That's the basis of these study designs. I want to point out as an aside that all of these studies are the placebo-controlled. Now, in the Western medical model, I think all of you know that we're told your mind does not affect your body. What you think, what you believe, your emotions have no bearing on your physical health. That's just kind of woo-woo alternative medicine stuff, right? When you're using a placebo, you're taking into an account the placebo effect. And that placebo effect is the concept of people's intentions, their thoughts, their beliefs about what they're taking affecting their physiology. So if someone thinks that they're taking the drug that will help them, it's more likely to help them. If they think they're being given a drug that will harm them, they're more likely to have side effects. This means that the same medical model that tells you that your mind and your thoughts have no bearing on your physical health actually understand just how powerful your mind is, that they require this to be included in the gold standard of research on anything.
So we're going to get into some examples. And again, keep your mind open and just listen to what I'm going to explain. Being the gold standard, as Dr. Wertkin explained, for the double-blind placebo-controlled study, we would expect this to be done for most drugs because this is our gold standard. Unfortunately, when it comes to the childhood vaccines, there's an issue here. And this is why a lot of people get called crazy and anti-vaxxers, because they're pointing this out. There's an issue with these studies. When it comes to childhood vaccines, they don't usually use an inert placebo. Normally, we will use saline because we know if I inject saline into your body, nothing's going to happen. It's neutral. It's close to the blood. So it's not going to cause any side effects, any ill effects. So that's the consensus, to use saline. But when it comes to children's vaccinations, they don't usually use saline. Why, you ask? Well, we're not sure. What do they use? They usually will use a combination of aluminum salts. What do we know about aluminum? Aluminum is a heavy metal. That is not an inert substance that doesn't cause problems. What does aluminum do? We know aluminum gets in the body and goes to the brain and causes all these issues like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all these fun things. We know aluminum causes problems. It's toxic. But yet they're using that as the placebo when it comes to childhood vaccinations. What's going on here? Or sometimes they will use another vaccine. That vaccination is not an inert substance. And so what's happening here is this science is coming out and saying, oh, we use this placebo, and so it showed this vaccine, was safe and effective, but you're not actually testing it with an inert substance. So we don't actually know what's actually happening here. We're not getting an accurate picture. And so a lot of people don't dive into this topic. So they hear placebo, they think saline. This is a very big problem for me. We are not actually doing the gold standard when it comes to our childhood vaccines. Now, the other issue here is they use a lot of semantics. They will use a lot of semantics here, like calling aluminum salts and vaccines placebos. You're going to hear, oh, they used a placebo, it was fine. Okay, but you start diving in and you're like, wait a minute. The people in the vaccine industry will also say, well, we can't use placebo because that's immoral. That's immoral. So they're just playing with words, and they're, playing with, it's immoral how is that immoral to see if something is safe or not? That's what I would like to know, because this is not helpful for anybody. It's not the gold standard, and using semantics to pretend you're doing the gold standard, that is corruption. That is fraud. And then saying, oh, it would be immoral if we didn't give a vaccination to a kid and we gave him placebo, that's immoral. You're not proving it's safe and effective. That's immoral. So here's the conundrum we're in when it comes to this issue.
This is such a controversial topic. And part of the reason it's so controversial is because when anybody raises a single question related to safety of vaccines, they're attacked. Doctors lose their licenses. They are vilified. The same happens with scientists, even when they still promote vaccines, because there have been practitioners that say, vaccines will be safer if we administer them this way. If we separate them out, we see less risk of side effects. One might think rationally, that's a good idea. How do we make the schedule safer? But that's not what happens. It immediately gets shut down and they're vilified because for some reason, the vaccine industry doesn't want people remotely questioning the safety. But as Dr. Tauzin was just explaining, they're not using good science. If you take a new vaccine and you compare it to an aluminum injection, and then you tell the public the side effects were the same in both arms, so if the placebo caused the same neurological damage as the shots, we can just dismiss it and say it's not real. That is not good science. Good science would say, oh, if they are showing the same side effects, maybe we need to investigate the impact of aluminum injections. Maybe we need to figure out how to make these safer, but that's not even remotely on the table. I want you guys to understand they are designing these studies in a particular way to try to illustrate an outcome that doesn't even actually exist. It is completely unrealistic to tell people that vaccines are safe and effective for everyone. There isn't a single drug or even natural substance that is safe for everybody at the same dosage. This is crazy. And so many people believe because they hear that the science is settled on vaccines, that means they're all safe and effective, that this has all been very rigorously researched to confirm all of this. And so what Dr. Tauzin is going to get into next is how the actual opposite is what's happening.
So what I want to show here is there's a company called ICANN who is going after the government and the CDC to try to ensure that these vaccinations are being tested properly and are showing they are actually safe and effective. And so this is one of the issues that they're bringing up is that not one of the shots on the childhood schedule is based on a long-term placebo-controlled trial. Not one. And if you can see this here, this column shows you if they were placebo tested, a long-term placebo-controlled trial. And by long-term, they're meaning a lot of these companies will do a study with a vaccination that lasts 1 to 2 days. Well, you can get side effects later than 1 to 2 days. So if you have a short study that, oh, everybody was fine 1 to 2 days after, okay, but you're not seeing what's happening in the long run. You're not catching the side effects that come later. And so this is what they're pointing out is there's not any long-term studies with actual placebos. The one that's green was the COVID shot. That's the only one that they had actual placebo for. And then the Dingvaxia, you'll also see is green. But all the rest of them, every single childhood vaccination is on this list. They're all in that red category. People are trying to combat this and say, that's not true. And again, they're using placebo as for aluminum salts and other vaccinations, which is not an actual real placebo. So again, they're using semantics to try to say this is not true. But this is what they have found. One more point I want to bring up here about ICANN and the childhood vaccination schedule is that they sent a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, to the CDC for studies that show and prove vaccines do not cause autism because they couldn't find any. And the CDC repeats that repeatedly. Vaccines do not cause autism. They do not cause autism. And I'm not sitting here saying they absolutely do. What I'm saying is there should be studies that back up what the CDC claims. If the CDC is claiming it doesn't, there should be studies to show that. So ICANN submitted the FOIA request for the DTaP, the Hep B, the Hib, PCV13, and IPV for those shots. And the CDC could not produce one single study in response to these FOIA requests. Not one study that proved vaccines do not cause autism. So this went back and sued them in a federal court. And the CDC had to admit that they did not have any studies to support that any of those vaccinations actually did not cause autism. What does that say? The science is not there. They're making a claim and they have absolutely nothing to back it up with. This is a problem for me. And it should be a problem for you. But again, people don't want to look at this because vaccines have become a religion. And people want to believe, okay, all these vaccines are safe and effective and they do not cause autism, but we do not have a study to actually show that. So this is just my point for people to understand. It may kind of pull the rug out from underneath your feet if you're thinking differently here. And it can be a lot to take, but just sit with that. You can go look this up and get more into this information if you want to question what we're doing and make sure we're showing you correct information. But these are facts that we're showing you here. This is not our opinion.
Yeah, it's not like we want these things to be true.
No, we
So,
don't want a lot of people suffering from things they think are safe and effective and things they think are helping humanity.
I wanted to mention or share with you all a recent report that came out related to the efficacy of the flu vaccine from 2024 to 2025. Many people may not be aware that they have to guess the strains for the flu way in advance, and they more often than not don't get it right. I think it's somewhere between 20 to 40% accuracy. So,
It's like throwing a dart at a dartboard.
yes. Yes.
Which one for next year?
Well, yes. So the Cleveland Clinic recently did a preprint study, and what they did is they evaluated over 53,000 adults to monitor those who got the flu vaccine compared to those who did not get the flu vaccine, and how many got sick and how long and all of that. And what they found was that the group that received the flu vaccine had a much higher rate of getting sick with the flu. So those who did not get the flu vaccine had a greater chance of prevention related to that. Now, this study has not yet been peer reviewed, so the standard medical community has already come out speaking out against this study and saying, well, you should just ignore it because the research hasn't been peer reviewed and we're assuming it's all fraudulent. So that's the stance they're taking, is just ignore the research that showed it wasn't very effective because we're telling you that it is. Now, how many of you have heard about the research that's been done on vitamin D for flu prevention? Because there was a study that came out of Canada over 10 years ago where they gave school-age children 2,000 units of vitamin D, and they tracked where I think the average was getting their vitamin D to a level of 35, which in my opinion is still quite low. But even with that, they found a 90% reduction in risk of upper respiratory infections in those kids. And around the same time, Japan did a similar study with vitamin D, except instead of 2,000, they only gave them, I think, 1,200, or maybe, yeah, I think it was around 1,200 IUs of vitamin D. And they found a significant reduction, maybe 40 to 60% in risk of contracting influenza A. So here we have two very well designed, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials showing that in school-age children, a particularly higher dosage of vitamin D was very safe and effective for preventing the flu. But how come the public isn't told about that? How come, if we really care about flu prevention among children and adults in the country, this isn't recommended in every school across the country? That somehow all that information on vitamins and their use for building up the immune system and preventing disease, that information gets suppressed. And the public only gets one message. You have to prevent the flu, and the flu shot is the only way. We could have another episode about flu and acute stuff and things like that. But for our purposes, please be aware that the information you're seeing is actually very biased and one-sided. And it just seems like there's a lot of agendas involved in the information that is being presented to the public.
And we are going to touch a little bit more on that and why you don't see a lot of alternative medicine research out there. Yeah, and money has a big thing to do with that, unfortunately. So back to talking about bad science. I get a lot of people who tell me it's so confusing. I'm reading some of the science and there's conflicting science. And I get it because it is. It is confusing. You're going to see that a lot. People will say, this is my conclusion, and they'll pull up a lot of science that supports that. And then you can also find a lot of science on the opposite side that supports the opposite conclusion. So what is the deal here? I think a lot of it is there is a lot of bad science out there. So you do have to take that deep dive and figure out who's funding it, what methods and all that. But also people they're using different methods to get a different hypothesis. And so we also have to look at that as well. But this is a huge piece. You're going to see studies on HRT that say hormones are fabulous. And then you have your studies on HRT that say they actually cause major side effects, including cancer. It's something you kind of have to take with a grain of salt if you're finding there's a lot of conflicting science. You have to be able to really dive deep into these and parse that out in order to see what's actually going on here. So continuing on, this is an article in the scientific literature about abusing and misusing statistics. This is a very common thing to do to get the results you want to get. So here's just a list this is a big list, and we're not going to dive into all of this. There's so many different ways that you can manipulate the data to get the result you want to get. And this is just a list of like 10 of them. But I'm not going to get into too much of that. I just wanted to show you it is possible, and this is where all that corruption is coming in. A lot of it is in the methods and the use of the statistics, the manipulating the data here. So the biggest one I want to talk about, because you're going to see this one everywhere. We see this one a lot, and this is absolute risk versus relative risk. They use this one all the time. So say you have 2 in a million people who got a disease, which is not a lot, right? And then they do an intervention and one of the people gets better. So if they gave you the absolute risk, they would say one person got better. That is not high at all. That is not impressive. Doesn't sound good. But if they tell you 50%, because they had 2 people and one got better, that's 50% of the people who were sick. Now that sounds really good. 50%. So that's the relative risk, is the 50%. And they do this all the time in different ways. They always quoting the relative risk because it's a percentage and it sounds so much better than the absolute risk. So that's always one of the questions I ask when I'm seeing studies on the news or in an article. Are they quoting relative risk to make it sound really good and give you this great percentage? Or are they actually telling you the absolute risks, which is usually quite small and not very impressive? So understanding just that little one is a clue for most people when they are evaluating science. So the other point I want to bring up too is that we have to be careful because the mainstream media, they twist stuff and they do this all the time. So you're going online, you see an article and you see this huge headline and you're like, wow, that sounds amazing. And I will tell you, it's probably wrong. So you see the mainstream media doing this all the time. They take a study and they tell you something that was not the conclusion because it gets clicks. It sounds good, right? You cannot trust the mainstream media. They're not very good at telling the truth, and they like to say things that sound good. So this is just an example that I had seen recently. This scientific article came out talking about meat consumption in people who have a certain gene type. And they found that if they gave meat to these people that had this certain gene type, that they actually had less dementia. Okay? Well, what does mainstream media say? They say seniors who eat more meat are less likely to develop dementia. Okay, that's not the conclusion that was drawn here. When you look at how many people actually have the ApoE genotype, it's like 25% of the population in America. But yet the mainstream is basically telling you all seniors should be eating more meat so they don't get dementia. not the conclusion that was drawn in the actual study. And this is why I wanted to point it out, because I came across this and I was like, this is a perfect example of them twisting stuff. I do not trust mainstream media. I used to watch CNN all the time when I was younger, and I blindly trusted what CNN told me. And I will say something very disturbing happened when I was watching CNN. I came across this story, a mass shooting at a school, which in itself is horrible. And so CNN was reporting on it, and they claimed that they had a student who had been in the shooting, who had had a bullet go through one side of his neck and come out the other side. And you're like, okay, that is a wow story. First of all, you hear that and you're kind of like, what? Like, that's pretty fantastical, but let me hear him out. It had happened apparently 6 hours prior, and they had the little boy who it happened to, who's up and walking and talking and out of the hospital. And if you're a medical professional, you know that is impossible. No one is going to have a bullet go in one side of their head and come out the other and be out of the hospital in a few hours walking and talking. That is impossible. Okay. And so I'm watching the story. I'm like, this is crazy. And then what they did to make matters even worse, so they took the little kid and they're like, show him your wound. They turn around. He's got a full head of hair down, pretty long, down to his shoulders. And he's got a bandage taped to his hair. And I'm sitting here going, what are they doing? I think people are so emotional when a school shooting happens, as you get, because it's horrible, and they're so emotional they're not actually questioning what's happening in front of their eyes. And they show this little kid with this full head of hair, and I'm sitting here going, medical professionals would never believe this. Because the first thing you do with a child who has a gunshot wound in his head is going to be shave his head, right? You're going to shave his head first, and you're going to put the bandage on the actual wound. You don't put a bandage on his hair. Like, none of this made any sense. And I quit watching CNN after that, because I was like, if you're going to make up a lie about a child who is supposedly in this mass shooting like this, and we can tell is a blatant lie, what else are you lying about? And I love to tell this story because I think people would be shocked to find that out. I think a lot of people still trust mainstream media. They are not understanding that these people are pushing certain stories to get people to watch them. And a lot of this stuff is not true. It's just not true. And so just wanted to share that with you guys, because this is happening a lot.
I have to say, I love that you shared that example. And I know that we're not deep diving expose on the news, but there is also a lot of evidence on how that people get paid to lie in the news as well. And I just want to highlight something that Dr. Tauzin just said, because it's really, really important. This happens to everyone. With anything in the news, the minute it gets that emotional hook in you, the minute it triggers that emotional response, the part of the brain involved in critical thinking shuts off. So it's so easy to get pulled in. And especially when you have no reason to question or doubt the validity of what they're saying, you automatically believe it. And they know that also if they repeat lies and they inundate people with the same message and it comes from all the news outlets, then it just gets in to your mind and you just believe it, even when they have actually showed the most ridiculous details that are completely not true. So thank you, Dr. Tauzin, for including that example. I think it's really helpful to illustrate for people what happens.
Yeah, but it makes you start questioning, like, how often are we being lied to? And I hate to be a negative Nelly, but I would say that percentage is very high. Very high. This is another example of this journalist scammed all this media into talking about chocolate like this science was so true. And so all the media was running with, eating chocolate can help you lose weight. It was such a joke. And you can read about this if you want. But this was another article I found where this journalist got the media to start spreading lies. We all know chocolate does not help you lose weight. We all know that. Okay? You can go sit there and eat chocolate all day. You're not going to lose anything. So if you hear a headline like this on the news, immediately trust yourself. If you think this is too good to be true, it probably is. Trust yourself and understand that this is probably something they're lying about, because we see this all the time.
We just want it to be true. We want
We
any
want it to be
excuse to
true.
be able to eat as much chocolate as we want.
Drink 5 glasses of wine every day for your health.
Yeah, there you
Okay.
go. Well, science says so.
Science.
Oh, man. On a slightly different angle, this is an example of a study. The paper that was published is called The Treatment of Migraines with Targeted Nutrition Focused on Improved Assimilation and Elimination. What this was a particular study looking at a supplement and its efficacy in treating migraines. And they didn't use a natural pain reliever for migraines. They actually used a supplement that targeted gut health. About 40% of migraine sufferers also are diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome. They may also have other GI issues, it just doesn't get diagnosed. But what they found with this study was that for these sufferers of migraines who received this specific supplement, there were marked improvements. I think they tested several variables to show significant improvements in quality of life in migraine sufferers. This was probably the first of its kind where the research was really looking at the correlation between gut function and neurological function. And there's a lot in Western medicine where they like to separate these things. Since that time, there has actually been a lot of other research looking at gut health and mental health and the relationship there, but the public doesn't hear about it. The public never heard about this study, and nothing ever went further with this research because they ultimately recognized that companies could not make a huge profit off of this. They don't profit off of natural supplements and cures. So this work pretty much got buried. Most practitioners are not even familiar with this product, and it's something I still use today. I have found tremendous benefit of this product for addressing certain digestive issues like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, but also autoimmune conditions and other things that most doctors may not connect to gut function, where many traditional naturopathic doctors do understand the role of how everything's connected to everything.
Why I wanted to bring up this study was because when I had heard Dr. Cincinnati talk about it, he said it was like 20 people and they all got benefit. Like the results were very profound.
Mhm.
And he said that they actually sent this to many popular scientific journals because the results were really good. And not one of those scientific journals would actually publish it. They do not want to publish science about alternative medicine. They don't like it. Why? Because they can't make money off of it. And so you have these amazing studies in alternative medicine that don't see the light of day, and nobody finds out about it because it's alternative medicine. And so I get that all the time. I get people and they're like, well, I need some studies on this. And I'm like, hey, good luck, bro. Because they they don't publish it. It's very rare that we do see maybe like vitamin D gets some publishing. There may be starting to publish a few more herbs and things, but you don't see a lot of these studies getting a lot of attention, unfortunately. And this is the world we live in.
And I'll
This
just
is the
add
world we
that I
live in.
happen to know two of the authors on this paper. Dr. Sensenig was one of my main mentors in clinical practice. And Tom Stavorowski was a man who, you know, had a lot of genuine enthusiasm for furthering our knowledge and research on natural medicine, and was so excited to get this information out there. And I can recognize how they all had this naivete of how the system worked. They thought if we can just show this data, then, then it'll get out there and people want to know more. And they had to unfortunately go through the experience of quite the opposite happening. And this happens all the time. This is just one example
All the
among
time.
so many. So many.
This is another issue I do want to bring up with science. And this is one of the problems I do have with science. It's called reductionism. And what this means is science still looks at the body as a mechanical system. And so when we do study something, we break it down into one little part and we isolate it from everything else so that we could see how it works, right? Which sounds like a good idea, but the only problem is that's not how our body works. Our body is a whole integrated intelligent system. And we've got many things going on at the same time. And so when we do break these things down and isolate them and study them, we may see some amazing things, but it doesn't always work. It doesn't translate. It doesn't translate to clinical experience. I'll give an example of CoQ10. I have seen so many amazing studies about CoQ10, the nutraceutical. That's an antioxidant in the body. I've seen so many amazing studies, and I used it with so many people, and I've never seen one person get benefit from it. Maybe it's just me. I don't know. But I'm like, how do you have all this good science on it? It's because they break things down. And when they break things down, it's a bit different. When you're working with a whole, it's a whole different energy. The body is something we can't just break down. And they do this all the time in medicine. The mind doesn't affect your body. Go see an eye doctor. You go see a foot doctor. You go see a heart doctor. I have people coming to me and they have all these different problems. And I'm like, yeah, I can help with all of those. And they're like, what? You don't need to go see a cardiologist and a rheumatologist? And I'm like, no, all of this is connected. You start healing the body, all of this starts getting better. And so this is part of the issue I do have with science is the reductionism, because I don't think it's actually showing us the results that you would see in a whole person.
Yes. And if I can add to that, just a couple of other examples, because this is such a significant part of the philosophy that distinguishes the Western medical model from the traditional naturopathic model. And one of those is even how we use medicine. And so again, let's say they decide to study an herb. And what they'll do is they will take one active constituent from the plant and then maybe mega dose it into pharmacological doses and give it to people to see, does this have an effect? But when you use the herb more traditionally, you're not just looking for one active part. You realize the wisdom in the plants and how they have constituents that work in multiple parts of the body simultaneously and can also work on the physical and the emotional and the energetic. So, and that gets me to how we apply the medicine, because so many people have said to me over the years that they tried natural medicine and it doesn't work. And I often have questions about it. And one of the reasons that comes up is people will try to take a natural supplement and use it like a drug. That is not how the medicine is traditionally applied. When the medicine is used appropriately to treat the whole person, it has a completely different effect and benefit for the body. Everyone's been conditioned to take a pill for each symptom, and the reductionistic model has been so ingrained that most people don't even realize that's where they're navigating from. They are maybe even just subconsciously believing that their body works like a machine with all of these separate parts where nothing's communicating with each other. But there is this other holism view that understands how everything is related to everything. And I remember even before I started working at the NIH, when I came across the field of research that was the neuroendocrine immunology research. And they were blown away by this concept that maybe your nervous system and your endocrine system and your immune system could all work together. They had to create a field specifically for this because they couldn't otherwise fathom that these systems work together. But they do. And again, this is part of why we are able to see people that walk in the door with any condition or multiple sets of conditions, because we're looking for what are the underlying imbalances that are actually creating these symptoms in all these different parts of the body, rather than, oh, let me give you something for this part and something for this part.
That is super important. So, okay. And then I just want to bring this up too, as we're coming to the end of this podcast today. Everything is corrupted, as we've been talking about. Big issue for me is when scientists don't get the right results, right? They get results that are opposite to whoever's paying them, what they should say. The statistics support a different conclusion. Well, what happens to these people is if they don't manipulate the data to get the results they should get, and if they actually stand up and say, wait a minute, that's not true, their whole reputation and career goes down the toilet. There is a concerted effort for everyone to go after these people and get nasty and do so many things and ruin their reputation in the public. And we see this all the time. And this is how I can always tell who's a real whistleblower and who's not. You see these whistleblowers that come out and say something, they expose something, a truth, and they're vilified in the media. Their reputation is shot. They're said, oh, they make up stuff. They did this and we need to send them to jail for this. They'll make up stuff that they did. When the whole country is vilifying someone, I'm like, hey, they're telling the truth. When you find a whistleblower who is still getting paid by certain agencies and they're saying things and they're getting podcasts and they're getting promoted and they're getting books and things, you can pretty much tell that person is probably pushing a false narrative. Because if you talk about things you shouldn't be talking about, they ruin you. So just understand, if you see a scientist who's been vilified in the media, they're probably telling the truth. And you can believe them.
Unfortunately, there are doctors and research scientists who get vilified. And then there are also physicians and research scientists who have lost their life for being outspoken about the truth. 2015 in particular was a year that I witnessed over 60 holistic doctors lose their life. This started with a medical doctor named Jeffrey Bradstreet, who lived in Florida. And part of his story is that his son became autistic and he began researching all ways to help his son with this. And I even had the opportunity to see him present at an autism conference. He seemed like a genuinely great man, honestly. And one of the things that he had come across was a particular molecule called GCMAF. And his research was showing GCMAF's success at treating both cancer and autism. Shortly thereafter, the FDA raided his office. And the next morning, he was found floating in a river with a shotgun wound to the chest, and it was labeled a suicide. Nothing about him or that whole situation actually indicated suicide, and my heart still goes out to his family. So that was the first in a whole series. And one of the doctors that was also taken out at that time is a physician that I also knew. And this story is quite personal to me because of my work at the NIH and also the training that I did with Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. So I just want to share with you a little bit of his story. He was an investigative journalist before he ended up going to medical school and becoming a conventionally trained oncologist. At one point, he was asked by his mentor, and his mentor was like the father of immunology in some ways and was the doctor who discovered bone marrow transplants. And that same mentor kept encouraging Dr. Gonzalez to research this wacky dentist named Dr. Kelly, who was apparently helping people reverse their cancers with nutrition and detox. And Dr. Gonzalez wanted nothing to do with that. He could not care less about anything alternative. He was very conventionally minded, but his mentor kept encouraging him to the point that he eventually went and researched, found that this alternative approach was safer and more effective. So he started to implement some of what he was learning with his oncology patients, and he was told not to do that, and that if he continued, he would be kicked out. And so he ended up leaving the institution that he was working out of. I can't remember which one, but he ended up opening a private practice in Manhattan. And immediately he was ostracized from the Western medical community and tremendously vilified. But he teamed up with another colleague, Dr. Linda Isaacs, and the two of them went into practice together, and he started implementing everything he learned. and creating rigorous records of everything because he wanted to create something that could be a repeatable process. And he had tremendous results using this approach for addressing every different type of cancer, and in particular, cancers that have a very poor prognosis, cancers that Western medicine says, can't help you. We have nothing for you. And this could be certain types of brain cancers. This can be frequently pancreatic cancers where it's not even operable and they're not going to respond very favorably to chemo or radiation. They typically give people about a 3-month life expectancy at this point. So he started working with people with these types of cancers and, again, implementing his approach, which involved nutrition detox and specifically the use of enzymes, which I'm happy to dive into more of these details in the future, but for these purposes, I'll skip those details. So when I was working at the NIH, the team of people that I was working with in that department, we went to a conference at Harvard on integrative cancer approaches, and I saw Dr. Gonzalez present on cases, and I was blown away by what he was demonstrating. He was showing very clearly the complete reversal of these cancers in people. And I just thought, this is so exciting and how great that we're going to research this. Little did I know at that time that he had already been approaching the NIH and basically begging them to research his work. It still took many, many years of him showing the data and begging them and saying, this could really, really help people. And so eventually, finally, NIH said, okay, we'll agree to do a study. But it turns out that they did everything to sabotage the study. They
So
really, really
sad.
did. And even with all of the things that they did to sabotage the research, his arm of the study still showed better outcomes than the chemotherapy arm. But then they went ahead and published the results stating the opposite. They published a paper saying, we researched this and our group of patients that received chemo had far better results and a way better quality of life than the people that did the whatever stupid diet and detox stuff. So Dr. Gonzalez, who was already very, very outspoken about his work, went ahead and wrote a book called What Went Wrong. And he shared the details of the corruption that happened around this research. Unfortunately, during 2015, he was part of the series of doctors that lost their life. And I won't get into the details there either, except to say that there is evidence that he was taken out. He's not the only one. There have been many practitioners before him that have also uncovered different causes and effective treatments for cancer. And many people don't realize that those are the practitioners that either get taken out or completely vilified and slandered. And it breaks my heart every time I encounter somebody who's lost a loved one and they say, maybe someday we'll find the cure for cancer. And they don't know that there already are many ways to safely and effectively treat cancer. And I think it might even be illegal for me to say that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm allowed to even legally tell people that there are these treatments. And to emphasize this, he created a specific approach that was highly individualized, but could also be applied universally using an approach of diet and detox and enzymatic therapy that is very safe and very effective. He never told people not to use chemo or radiation or not to get surgery, but for people who already failed those treatments or didn't want those treatments, here's another way that you could do it. Why is this information being so suppressed from the public? What is wrong with giving people the honest information to let them choose for themselves? I'm sure there are people that hear about the Gonzalez approach and go, I don't want to do that. Okay, you don't have to. You can do another thing. But what about the people who don't want chemotherapy and want another way and don't even know that these ways actually exist and work? So, if you are interested, I highly recommend reading this book on what went wrong. He goes into all of the details. He goes into a little bit of his background. If you want to know more, I want to say one of the first books he published was called One Man Alone, sharing his story of what it was like being a medical doctor who was highly revered in the cancer world, only to now, if you search him on Wikipedia, it will just say what a quack he was. This quack that I personally saw help cure over 100 cases of cancer. So I know from my own experience how successful it was. I know how much integrity this man had as a physician and a researcher. And I'm also grateful to have this opportunity to share this information with you. I know that it's not an easy topic to hear about. And this whole, these two episodes where we're talking about the corruption of science, it can be devastating to learn about. And it can also be intimidating for Dr. Tauzin and I to risk putting ourselves in this position where we're going to be putting targets on ourselves potentially for sharing this information. But I also feel strongly that if she and I know what we know and we continue to stay silent, then we're essentially being complicit in the same corruption. So I hope that you take some time to let all of this sink in for you and recognize that Dr. Tauzin and I are very dedicated to genuinely helping people, genuinely being of service, and we are willing to risk our own reputations by sharing this information and telling the truth. In spite of even 10, 11 years ago, we literally lost over 60 doctors. There was really only one journalist at the time that was even reporting on this. I found one other journalist at the time, but it was predominantly Erin Elizabeth who reported on all of
Mm,
these deaths.
yeah,
Most people have no idea that this happened because, again, they didn't put this in the mainstream media
yeah.
very
And you
intentionally.
see it happening right now with scientists. There's all these scientists, plasma scientists, people associated with UFOs and things like that, are all of a sudden ending up missing and dying. And this has been in the news, um, or not the mainstream media, but this has been in the alternative media. And this, you see the same thing playing out. It's not just, it's in every big arena. It's not just doctors that this
Yep.
is happening to. It's all over. Plasma science, I'm not going to get into that, but plasma science, they do not want anybody talking about plasma science. And you probably don't even know what that is because you don't hear about it. And that is some amazing, crazy science. And the government doesn't want anybody knowing about it. They try to hush anybody who does science, who does research on plasma outside of the government. So just understanding a lot of good information is getting suppressed. And I think in this day and age, it's all starting to come out. And I think just realizing that and use discernment because, not everything is coming out is true. There's a lot of people putting out fake stories. We see that there's a lot of people trying to get attention, but using discernment. And I think that is even the spiritual lesson that we're all learning right now in the collective is to use discernment because you can't just blindly trust anything anymore. You have to ask questions. You have to ask, where did this come from? And I did the same thing today. As we prepared for this podcast, I was putting stuff in there and I was like, where did I get that from? Is that true? And then I would go and research it, make sure it was true because I didn't want to sit here and spit out something that I had heard along the way that wasn't true. And it was really eye-opening for me too, to kind of take a deep dive into some of these topics like, oh yeah, that is true. And this is what was happening. I got to go into a lot more detail. And that does bring me, be careful with Google because Google does have an agenda. And I guess we'll kind of be ending in just a second. And so I do want to bring this up. You Google something in Google, the little AI will say, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. But when you actually dive into it, it's wrong. And so we have to understand that Google does have an agenda. It is biased. And you do have to do a little bit of deeper research into something. A lot of articles are buried, which is sad. A lot of information is buried. Even now, you look into some alternative medicine, you see all the top 10 articles that come up is all the medical institutions. And I'm like, medical institutions know nothing about alternative medicine. Why is it all their stuff coming up saying, oh, yeah, this isn't work? Where's all the actual real alternative medicine research? That's buried on the 5th and 6th page of Google. Nobody goes to that, right? So be careful about where you're getting your information. If it's mainstream, it's going to be biased. It just is. If you look in Wikipedia, look up naturopathic doctors and chiropractors, they still call us quacks. Even though we have an actual medical degree, they don't say that. They don't mention that. Oh, we're just quacks. And we've had so many naturopathic doctors go to Wikipedia and say, what are you posting here? We have a medical diploma. We go to medical school for 4 years. They won't change it. They won't touch it. So you can see that there's definitely an agenda, and just understand where you're getting your information from, but do question and do look more into this.
Yes. And I want to just add, because we were very heavily focused today on data, on facts, on the science. But sometimes you don't need to know the science. If your intuition tells you something, you can trust it. And I know that it's even harder to trust intuition when we don't understand it. However, I want to encourage and give you permission to trust your intuition on things, even when you don't have all the information to necessarily back it up. It doesn't mean you're claiming it as fact, but almost all of us get some type of internal knowing or a sense or a feeling. This will be good for me. This won't be good for me. And then we can talk to somebody and they can override that or talk you in or out of something that your intuition's telling you otherwise. Please, 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 as much as possible, allow yourself to trust your intuition on and act on it, even if it doesn't make any sense to you. I know it's on the opposite side of the science spectrum, but to me, it is all included. It is all really important and significant.
Science can be a powerful tool, but it was never meant to replace wisdom, and it was never meant to override the intelligence that you have in your body as well.
Remember to keep listening to your body. And if you're not sure how, keep listening to this show. Want to find Dr. Robin Tauzin, you can go to denvervitalistmedicine.com, or if you want to find me, you can go to dravivawertkin.com or naturemedical.com, and we will have those links in the description below.
Thank you. So honor your nature and keep choosing health. And we're going to see you next time on Truth Bombs and Tinctures. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.